Remember to sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. Every Friday, you'll receive an email from the Washington Times giving you a look inside the stories we talk about on the podcast. The history, politics, culture in all its complexity. Sign up at historyasithappens.com. History as It Happens, February 14th, 2023. America's Man in Pakistan.
I request you all to remain calm and support your armed forces in the re-establishment of order to pave the way for a prosperous future for Pakistan.
I can say that if there has been a coup, we would seek the earliest possible restoration of democracy.
Usually, coups take place against democratic leaders. Here, a coup has taken place against an unpopular despot.
Your armed forces have never and shall never let you down.
Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City.
That looks like a second plane.
2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Pakistan has taken a considered decision to be a part of the coalition, to be with the United States.
Friendship between the United States and Pakistan is vital to the security and stability of South Asia.
As the President said, we are in the hunt together.
Pervez Musharraf was once billed as an indispensable partner in the U.S. war on terrorism, but it didn't work out for Musharraf or Pakistan or even the United States. The military dictator's downfall after a decade in power exposed the risks of working with the U.S., of riling religious radicals in his own country, because American and Pakistani interests in Afghanistan could never align. And now Pervez Musharraf is dead. That's next with Peter Bergen as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The most wanted man in the world is found and killed living in a house just a few blocks away from Pakistani military facilities.
Musharraf had a tricky relationship with the United States because on the one hand he was helping out, on the other hand the CIA drone program wasn't at all popular in Pakistan, quite the reverse. And so he had to thread a pretty tricky needle.
So I have to admit, I forgot about Pervez Musharraf. And when I heard about his death a couple weeks ago, I didn't know he was still in self-imposed exile in Dubai and very ill with an incurable disease. But the memories came back quickly of the time all Americans were introduced to the general-turned-president of Pakistan who had taken power in a bloodless coup in 1999. It was early 2002. Musharraf made his first visit to the White House, where he pledged to President Bush his commitment to fight terrorism and foster democracy in his own country.
I am gratified that my vision of Pakistan as a dynamic, liberal, progressive, peaceful, and genuinely democratic Muslim country and the decisions I announced on 12 January have evoked a supportive response in the United States. I believe that Pakistan-United States relationship must draw strength from our past relationship as we move to a new century, a changed world, and meet the challenges faced ahead.
Pakistan's continuing support of Operation Enduring Freedom has been critical to our success so far in toppling the Taliban and routing out the al-Qaeda network. Yet President Musharraf has made an even broader commitment. He has declared that Pakistan will be an enemy of terrorism and extremism wherever it exists, including inside his own border.
Again, that was in early 2002, but the relationship would prove difficult. U.S. officials believe Pakistan's military and intelligence services, rather than hunting bin Laden and al-Qaeda types, were harboring them instead, or at the very least not trying hard enough to find them in the forbidding, mountainous terrain of the tribal areas along the Afghanistan border. For his part, Musharraf felt the Americans didn't truly understand the bind he was in. At a joint news conference a few years later in 2006, reporters asked about a peace deal, a ceasefire Musharraf had just signed with the Taliban in North Waziristan, where Islamic militants had promised to stop attacking the government in exchange for security guarantees.
And may I very briefly say, and what I explained to the President, that this is a holistic approach that we are taking to fighting terrorism in Pakistan. This deal is not at all with the Taliban. As I said, this is against the Taliban, actually. This deal is with the tribal elders of North Waziristan Agency.
When the president looks him in the eye and says the tribal deal is intended to reject the Talibanization of the people and that there won't be a Taliban and there won't be al-Qaeda, I believe him. You know? I mean, this is a person with whom I've now had close working relationships for 5.5 years. And when he says, if we find, or when we find Osama bin Laden, he will be brought to justice, I believe him. And we'll let the tactics speak for themselves after it happens.
But privately, as Peter Bergen wrote in his book, The Longest War, Bush told Musharraf at a White House dinner, "We got real concerns about this, whether it's going to work." Bergen is New America's Director of the International Security and Future of War Programs, and he's an expert on al-Qaeda, one of a handful of Western journalists to have interviewed bin Laden. He goes on to say in that book, as part of the peace deal, the Pakistani government gave local militant leaders $540,000 so they could repay loans they had taken from members of al-Qaeda. And soon it became clear that Musharraf's deal had backfired by allowing militants to regroup in the tribal areas where they launched cross-border attacks against U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Also at that news conference, President Bush was asked about a report that the United States had threatened to bomb Pakistan to get it to cooperate with the war on terrorism in the days after 9/11.
First I heard of this was when I read it in the newspaper today. I guess I was taken aback by the harshness of the words. All I can tell you is that shortly after 9/11, Secretary Colin Powell came in and said, President Musharraf understands the stakes and he wants to join and help.
Well, that is not exactly how it went down, so let's rewind to the days immediately after 9/11. Musharraf tried to warn U.S. officials of the dangers of invading Afghanistan. He told the U.S. ambassador that the United States was not a reliable ally because of the way it abandoned the region after the anti-Soviet jihad. And his generals cautioned against abandoning the Taliban to side with the Americans. But the U.S. would not listen. They gave Musharraf an ultimatum: you're with us or against us. The story of the rise and fall of Pervez Musharraf reflects the greater folly of the war on terrorism, of trying to defeat enemies like al-Qaeda and the Taliban by invading another country. Not just any country, the graveyard of empires, as Afghanistan is called. Of having to rely on a country like Pakistan, roiled by its own volcanic politics and instability. Defeat and disgrace came to Musharraf first, and then the U.S. as our last soldiers evacuated Kabul in 2021. Peter Bergen, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Martin.
And I guess I should say hello, neighbor, kind of. We live within a few blocks of each other here in Washington. I won't give out any addresses, but it is nice to see you again. So, did Musharraf's reluctant embrace of the United States after 9/11, did that ultimately prove to be his undoing?
An interesting question. Yeah, I mean, Musharraf himself, as you know, Martin, was really a secularist, in my view. You know, there was a famous picture of him holding two of his dogs, which are Pekingese. Now, of course, if you're a highly observant Muslim, you don't have dogs. They're regarded as unclean. And I think that photo, which I think predated 9/11, said a lot about Musharraf as a person. A, that he had dogs. B, that he was willing to be photographed with them and, you know, make a show of it. And his predecessor as a military dictator, General Zia, who, of course, was instrumental in the U.S. effort to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan, he was a real Islamist. I mean, I visited Pakistan when Zia was in charge, and he ran a real dictatorship. You could feel it in the air. You know, people were following you around. There was no real free media. Musharraf, you know, he did come to power in a military coup, but he wasn't running that kind of military dictatorship. It was a bloodless coup. It was pretty popular when it happened, as I recall, in 1999. A lot of Pakistanis were sort of fed up with what they saw as a corrupt political class that was running the show at the time. And he came into power, and I think there was a lot of excitement, actually, about him, because Musharraf himself was not personally corrupt. He seemed to promise a more orderly Pakistan, but without reverting to this dictatorship of General Zia. And then, of course, 9/11 happens, and he faces a real choice. And the U.S. really didn't give him much of a choice.
Those are ultimatums, pretty much.
Yeah, as I understand it, people said versions of, we'll bomb you back in the middle of the Stone Age if you don't cooperate. And they got the message, the Pakistanis got the message, and they allowed Pakistani territory to be used for, first of all, attacking the Taliban in terms of Pakistani air bases, and then they allowed it to be used for the CIA drone program. Musharraf had a tricky relationship with the United States because on the one hand, he was helping out. On the other hand, the CIA drone program wasn't at all popular in Pakistan, quite the reverse. And so he had to thread a pretty tricky needle. If you look back in the first years after 9/11, the Pakistanis were actually very helpful in arresting people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was arrested on March 1st, 2003, in Rawalpindi, which is the military headquarters of the Pakistani military. And they handed him over to the CIA and then eventually ended up in Guantanamo. And they did that with 2 or 3 quite senior members, leaders of al-Qaeda, that they handed over in the first years after 9/11.
But taking sides against the Taliban was unpopular in Pakistan among ordinary people and among elements within the ISI and the military. Pakistan had been the Taliban's chief patron, their chief sponsor.
He took some risks, and in fact, he almost paid with his life on 2 occasions. It's a complicated story because at a certain point, the U.S. got their patience ran out. They got very angry at Musharraf towards the end of the Bush second term because they sort of felt that he wasn't really delivering on opposing al-Qaeda, opposing the Taliban. On the other hand, he had a problem at home, as you point out, that the Taliban were somewhat popular in Pakistan. I don't think they were super popular, but they certainly had their supporters. There were religious parties in Pakistani's parliament that were pro-Taliban. The ISI, the military intelligence agency, had backed the Taliban before 9/11. And so he had to navigate all this. And I mean, he did a pretty good job of it. I think the best evidence for that is al-Qaeda certainly tried to kill him on 2 separate occasions. They sent suicide bombers into his motorcade with the massive bombs. He was lucky to survive in 2003 timeframe. So al-Qaeda certainly understood that he was helping the United States go after them. They were getting arrested in Pakistan. But I think at a certain point, he also faced his own problems. There was a Red Mosque incident in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, in 2007, when a group of Islamist militants took over the Red Mosque. And in fact, I visited that mosque just before that time period. And, this was a mini domestic insurrection. It was in the capital of Pakistan. Hundreds of armed militants took this mosque over. Then the Pakistani military attacked it. And after that, Musharraf really became very unpopular with the sort of religious right.
It cracked down, right? Became more dictatorial. He got rid of the Constitution or suspended it.
He also went after the chief of the Supreme Court, and also he went after the media. So over time, he became more dictatorial, sort of began to believe his own propaganda, I guess, some more, having started with a fair amount of excitement about who he was when he took power in 1999.
I know my question was a tough one. Did this prove to be his downfall, right? His embrace of the United States, however reluctant, because as you just said, there was a backlash against him. Pakistan had a lot of internal problems too that are kind of hidden from ordinary Americans. We really don't know about the internal politics in most countries.
Pakistan is a really complicated country to run. It hasn't had very effective leadership, whether military or civilian. It's a country of 200 million plus people. Karachi is, one of the biggest cities in the world. It's got 20 million people or so. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of corruption. Of course, you've got India to the south, which has fought 3.5 wars with Pakistan, all of which Pakistan has lost. The military has always been in charge of Pakistani foreign policy, Pakistani national security policy. So even the civilian governments have always tended to be relatively weak. And so judged by that standard, Musharraf wasn't worse than most Pakistani leaders. After 9/11, he got an ultimatum from the United States. Basically, you're either with us or against us. And then also, the Pakistanis derived not insignificant amount of financial aid.
Military.
No, I know. Let me say, the president is not afraid to bring up the issue of F-16s. He has been a strong advocate for the sale of F-16s to Pakistan. In the package that we discussed, the 5-year, $3 billion package, half of that money goes for defense matters. of which the F-16 won't be a part. Nevertheless, we want to work closely with our friend to make sure that the package meets the needs of the Pakistan people.
Which was very important to military leaders like Musharraf and the military establishment. And we, the United States, paid the Pakistani military for using their bases, for any military operations they carried out, gave them military aid in a country that has major budget deficits. So they were also benefiting from the U.S.-Pakistani relationship. But it was difficult because the drone program was unpopular in Pakistan, the CIA drone program. And so I think over time, the United States certainly wore out its welcome with ordinary Pakistanis.
It was a very difficult balancing act. And my question about what proved to be Musharraf's downfall, there was also blowback. We've discussed blowback before in the context of U.S. foreign policy. Well, Pakistan faced blowback. It created or helped create the Taliban in 2007 all the way to 2014, the so-called Pakistani Taliban, basically the Pashtuns on the eastern side of the Durand Line, right? Went to war against the state, and part of that war overlapped with Musharraf's rule. He was out of there in 2008, but it continued for several years after.
The Taliban became a sort of Frankenstein that the Pakistanis couldn't control, and eventually the Pakistani Taliban, which was located in Pakistan's tribal regions on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Pakistani military went in there 2012, 2013 and routed them out. But Pakistani Taliban killed thousands, tens of thousands of ordinary Pakistani civilians, attacked the Pakistani military. So, there was real blowback. Ironically, now the Pakistani Taliban is now to a large degree based in Afghanistan, which is controlled by the Afghan Taliban. And in fact, there's never been, in my mind, a really big distinction between these two groups. Because, as you say, they're Pashtuns. The Pashtuns are one of the largest ethnic groupings in the world without a state. And they straddle both sides of Afghanistan and Pakistan. In fact, I think there are more Pashtuns on the Pakistani side. So,
Zia, right? You mentioned Zia before. He wanted to unify Pashtuns on both sides of the Durand Line, which is the border between the two states. Rather than building an ethnic national identity, the madrasas were meant to grow an Islamist identification. The madrasas being the religious schools where the Taliban learned.
Yeah. Siraj Haqqani, who's the Minister of the Interior for Taliban right now, his last name, Haqqani, indicates that...
the Haqqani network.
It's the Haqqani network, but they also, many of these Taliban leaders all studied in the same madrasa in Pakistan, which is called the Haqqani school, or the Haqqaniya school, and it's outside Peshawar. The people who are running Taliban control of Afghanistan today, almost without exception, many of them went to Pakistani madrasas.
I want to ask you about the Bush administration, whether they really understood the jam Musharraf was in. But you mentioned all those wars between Pakistan and India. Didn't Musharraf start one of those?
Oh, yeah, he did. Musharraf made a sort of big error, which is
before he was president.
Yeah, he was chief of the army during the invasion of Kargil, which was not a war, but it was kind of a mini war where the Pakistanis tried to go into Indian-controlled Kashmir, and they basically were handed a pretty severe defeat in late 1999, if memory serves. And then Musharraf then takes control in a military coup. The coup is pretty widely applauded because it was a bloodless coup. Musharraf seemed like a reasonable guy. I met with Musharraf just before he went back to Pakistan. He basically went back thinking that he had a political future. If you recall, Benazir Bhutto went back just before she was killed by the Taliban. She was 54. She was running for prime minister. She would have become prime minister for the third time. And I think she would have been a very effective prime minister. And she was greeted at the airport by like 1 million people. It was kind of extraordinary. And Musharraf, in his own mind, thought he would go back to Pakistan and he would be greeted at the airport by 1 million people. Instead, he was greeted by like members of his immediate family and like 5 followers. By the time he decided to go back, he'd really worn out his welcome. And he didn't come out of a political party like Benazir or a political dynasty like Benazir Bhutto. And
he didn't have popular basis for his rule.
Yeah, he didn't have a popular base. That's a good way of putting it. I think that...
He was in an airplane when the coup took...
Yeah, if you look at the way that Pakistani politics happens, it's a lot of it is familial, hereditary. It's families who, so many of them are sort of so-called feudal families like the Bhuttos, who control land and who've traditionally been in politics. And Musharraf was not that. He came from a middle-class family. His father, I think, served in Turkey. He grew up spent some of his childhood in Turkey, and he was very influenced by Ataturk, who, of course, was a secular leader in
modernizer.
Turkey and a modernizer. And that was Musharraf's sort of model. But yeah, so when he went back, he'd worn out his welcome, and I think the charges were brought against him of corruption and
treason
and other. It's hard for me to adjudicate if those charges really have any merit. Certainly, he did mount a military coup. There's no doubt about it. It wasn't a sort of typical coup, but he really misread the situation when he went back.
About Bhutto, there's always been rumors, unsubstantiated stuff out there that he had a hand in.
I don't think he had a hand in the assassination of Benazir Bhutto. If he had a hand, it was in the following way. He probably didn't provide her as much protection as he should have. She was his political rival. She was an extremely popular politician. If she was running for prime minister again, I think she probably would have won. She'd been prime minister twice before. He certainly regarded her as a political rival. Now, I think it's pretty clear the Pakistani Taliban killed her. They threatened they would kill her. They took credit for it afterwards. She was certainly seen as a threat to them. A, she was a woman. B, she was very clear about she would be going after al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And so they killed her. If Musharraf had any role in that, it was one of omission, not commission. She had to get her own independent bodyguards to protect her rather than, having the Pakistani military really protecting her.
So a couple of days after 9/11, U.S. diplomat Wendy Chamberlain, she was scheduled to meet Musharraf anyway, but then 9/11 does happen. So her first meeting with Pervez Musharraf is about how the United States now wants Pakistan to do all these things for it. And she did hand him a list of ultimatums. And in the book, Directorate S by Steve Call. I'm sure you've read this one, Peter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well marked up.
Yes. Excellent book. Very, very long, but detailed. So this meeting between basically the representative of the United States in Pakistan and the new president there, although Musharraf had been in office for a couple of years by that point. He is trying to impress upon Chamberlain how difficult this situation's going to be. And as you know, I've argued with you that the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan was poorly thought out, the difficulties of trying to deal with a problem like al-Qaeda with military force. In other words, by invading Afghanistan. And I'll finally get to my point here, citing a passage in Steve Call's book. Musharraf is trying to make this point to Chamberlain. It's hard for me to sign up to support a military operation that lacks any details. I just can't send 2 brigades into Afghan soil. Do you sense that he had a point here and that the Bush administration never quite understood what it was getting into in a war in Afghanistan that would have to rely on Pakistan that had its own issues there?
Look, I mean, President Kennedy, after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, said, victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. So look, I mean, what we got into in Afghanistan, but no one could anticipate all the different, it's a whole other subject for a whole other discussion.
Yeah, Martin. We've talked about it in the past, but yeah.
Getting back into the Bush administration's view of the situation at the time is like, okay, well, they're not handing over bin Laden. And the Taliban basically, the Taliban weren't a client state of the Pakistanis, but the Pakistanis were supporting them. But like any proxy relationship, it wasn't like, I'm going to tell you what to do and then that person's going to do it. It was more complicated. And when the Bush administration went into Afghanistan, the United States knew almost nothing about Afghanistan. That's why the CIA was the first in. We closed our embassy there in 1989. There was very little understanding of it. There was very little understanding of the Taliban. The CIA was the only entity in the U.S. government who had any connections to the Afghan opposition. They were first in. Then the U.S. military went in, relatively small numbers. It's hard for listeners perhaps to recall, but the U.S. military was very risk-averse at the time. The last time it had any kind of war was the Kosovo Air War, in which there were 0 American casualties. Right. The last thing that was embedded in the U.S. military consciousness was the Black Hawk Down incident, in which 18 American servicemen were killed in Somalia in '93, and that really caused a lot of risk aversion amongst the Pentagon. Of course, after 9/11, that risk aversion began to dissipate, but that was sort of in the DNA. So, look, I don't think the Bush administration, it's not just that they couldn't explain to Musharraf what they wanted to do in Afghanistan. They couldn't explain to themselves because they didn't really know. They knew they wanted to get rid of the Taliban. That happened very quickly. Bombing campaign began October 3rd, 2001, and the Taliban was overthrown by December 5th, 2001. So this is one of the fastest military victories in American history.
Well, I'll bring up another Bush administration demand, according to Steve Call. They wanted Musharraf to seal the Afghan-Pakistan border, and he said, sorry, that's impossible.
Well, he was right about that. Yes. I mean, look, they're still trying to seal it now. The Pakistanis have actually built a fence, which just in recent years, I'm not sure if it's been completed or not, but that border is, I think it's 1,500 miles long. A lot of it goes through an extremely remote desert area in Baluchistan. Then the rest of it goes through essentially the foothills of the Himalayas and the Khyber, up to the Khyber Pass and beyond. So this is some of the most remote, desolate areas in the world. So there's no way to seal that off. I mean, because the Pashtuns live on both sides, there's a lot of people who have family on both sides. They come back and forth, and that's all completely legitimate. So that was not going to happen. We can't seal the United States-Mexico border with, this
2,000-mile border.
Yeah, and this border is over some of the most remote, inhospitable sections of desert and mountains.
There's another issue here, too, and that is Pakistan's interests and the U.S. interests in Afghanistan could never align.
They never could. Relations between states are not relationships between buddies. I mean, let's start with that. I mean, the fact that we're having an alliance with any country doesn't mean that they're going to ignore their own interests. They're going to have their interests and we're going to have ours. And the United States' interests and Pakistan's interests may sometimes align and sometimes not. And the one area where they were never going to align, and which always caused a great deal of heartache for the American policymakers, is that Pakistan has a doctrine called strategic depth. They've lost 3 major wars with India and 1 minor war. And they want on their eastern border a state that is at least somewhat compliant with their interests, which is why they've always been somewhat supportive of the Taliban. Because
they wanted a Pashtun government in Kabul.
And also one that isn't remotely aligned with India.
Yes.
Because, they've had governments in Kabul run by Pashtuns. Karzai is a Pashtun, but he'd spent some of his life living in India. So they want a regime in Kabul that is anti-Indian, and the Taliban fit the bill. So that's why they've tended to support the Taliban over time. And I want to be clear that the Taliban, there's a group of people who've either served in Afghanistan and a lot of Afghans who feel like, but for Pakistan, the Taliban wouldn't exist. I think that is not true. The Taliban certainly have derived some financial support. They've lived in Pakistan. They've had safe haven in Pakistan. But at the end of the day, they've got some support in Afghanistan that's real. They're not going to just blindly do whatever the Pakistanis want them to do.
No, well, they don't need Pakistani weapons anymore. They have ours.
Well, that's right.
Yeah. So at one point, or a couple of different points during Musharraf's rule, he reached what were called peace agreements, if you will, in the tribal areas. In the tribal areas with people that the United States didn't want him to make agreements with. I mean, who were these folks, and how did this contribute to the worsening of the U.S.-Pakistan bond?
During the sort of 05-06 time period, he came to agreement with some of the militant groups that lived in the tribal regions, militant groups that were basically where al-Qaeda was hiding. By the end of the second Bush administration, people had got very fed up in Washington with Musharraf because they saw him as sort of double dealing on the question of al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
And they knew they were all in Pakistan.
Yeah, and of course also the situation in Afghanistan was getting worse. Yes. Suddenly there were suicide attacks starting in 2006. There were having been none. The Taliban started mounting a lot of suicide attacks in Afghanistan. The situation in the Afghan war started getting worse. So I think the relations between the Bush administration and Musharraf sort of soured by the end of the second term.
What did Musharraf accomplish?
Wow, that's a great question.
The nice thing about being the host is that I can ask these questions that I don't even have the answers to.
Well, I mean, I think it's a mixed... I mean, he did take power in a military coup. That is not a healthy situation in a democracy. Yeah. So I would say that's a pretty big black mark against him, even though he didn't run a traditional military dictatorship with executing bunches of military opponents. And he actually, there was a fairly open media and this kind of thing.
Yeah, any Pakistani leader was going to be presented with ultimatums by the U.S. after what happened.
Well, that's true.
And that difficulty would have been there regardless.
Yeah, this gets back to the points about interest versus, the United States' interest was getting rid of the Taliban, getting a hold of bin Laden, getting rid of al-Qaeda. He went along with that. But I mean, in terms of sort of positive, the economy in Pakistan did sort of reasonably okay under Musharraf. He had a relatively good relationship with the United States most of the time. Pakistan and India didn't go to war once he was in power. That may have been because both sides had nuclear weapons. There was, I think, a warming of relations with India a little bit during his time.
He did make an effort there.
But, I'm sort of scratching my head a little bit. It's not like he has some massive legacy that you can point to. Maybe there's some apologists who would point to things that I'm not aware of. But Pakistan has been pretty ill-served by its leaders.
Civilian or military.
And I would sort of put him in that category.
When someone like Musharraf dies, it does offer us an opportunity to reflect and reassess on the past 20 years, right? I mean, it's amazing how much time has passed. I actually had forgotten about Musharraf. I had forgotten that he was living in exile. He did not die in Pakistan. Body was flown back, and there was a private ceremony with some military people there, but no large public ceremony like when an American president dies, right? It's a big event, and it's open to the public.
I mean, based on the news accounts, this seemed to happen in the middle of the night with no one there, and it was like almost a stealthy burial. There was no state funeral. There was no, parade through the streets.
Our Americans, and that includes me, our attention ebbs and flows. We pay attention to one part of the world for a while when it's in our interest too. There was good reason why Musharraf was a major figure in the news for a while. But I think our attention has waned recently. We don't think or talk much about Pakistan anymore because the U.S. is out of Afghanistan. Yeah. How would you describe the nature of U.S.-Pakistani relations today? I mean, what's the basis for it? We're not fighting the Taliban anymore.
Well, Pakistan has disappeared from the front pages of American newspapers and is, as you say, no longer a subject of discussion for a super easy reason. When you have up to 100,000 American troops in Afghanistan, Pakistan is going to be important. Why is that? Because the only way you can supply them is through routes that go through Pakistan. Kandahar Airport, which is in southern Afghanistan, at the height of the war in Afghanistan, was the busiest airport in the world, which is kind of an interesting...
That's amazing.
How could that happen? Because we were allowed to use Pakistani airspace. You think about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is surrounded by Iran on one side, China on another side, former states of the Soviet Union to the north. Pakistan was the only really reliable ally the United States had, and also had a land bridge. Pakistan is on the Indian Ocean, and of course, much of the supplies going to American troops were going through the land bridge through Pakistan into Afghanistan, which is an entirely landlocked country. So we really needed Pakistan. And of course, now that all Americans are no longer in Afghanistan, for Pakistanis, that may not be the end of the world. They do want a relationship with us. Their foreign minister, Benazir Bhutto's son, Bilal Bhutto, is coming to Washington fairly frequently. Of course, they've had these massive floods in Pakistan.
Yeah, about a third of the country underwater.
Yeah. And what Bilal Bhutto wants from the United States and other major Western powers, that Pakistan produces like a tiny fraction of the world's global warming, and yet is going to be really subject to, whether it's heat or flood, to some of the worst aspects of global warming. So his big theme is that the United States and others in the West should pay into a fund to help them kind of ameliorate what they know is coming, which is more and more bad floods, more and more extreme heat.
Well, Musharraf said this to Wendy Chamberlain, to your point just now. He said, you people aren't reliable. You're going to leave us with a mess at some point.
Well, that's the American story. Look what we did in Vietnam. Look what we just done in Afghanistan.
Well, my position on both of those, of course, is that the United States lost both those wars. But the U.S. has this informal alliance right now in the Indo-Pacific, the Quad. Yeah. The Quad is India, Australia, Japan, and I think South Korea. Pakistan is not in that grouping. I mean, it is still an important country. It has nuclear weapons. It's politically unstable. It seems that this should be an issue. But
the Quad is United States, Australia, India, Japan, right?
Japan, not South Korea. That's not in the Quad.
Yeah, I think so.
The U.S. is one of the four. I made a 5 Quad, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Pakistan is not part of it. I mean, probably because it would be a deal killer with India. There's real enmity. 1 million people died during partition, more or less, in 1947. That's within living memory for a lot of people. So, and then you've had 3 wars which the Pakistanis have lost, and 1 minor war that the Pakistanis have lost. So there's real enmity there. Both sides have nuclear weapons. There was no way the Indians would allow their mortal enemy to be in this kind of mutual aid alliance, I don't think, and vice versa. and the Modi government, which is running India now, is a Hindu nationalist government. I mean, they're even more anti-Pakistani than previous Indian governments. And so there is real enmity there.
Well, one of my regular guests, a fellow by the name of Jeremy Suri, wrote a book called The Impossible Presidency. He was not talking about Pakistan, but it seems like it is an impossible country to govern given some of what we've been discussing here.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very hard country to govern. The military are always in the background, really kind of with a veto of a foreign policy and national security.
And the ISI, which is their CIA, basically.
It's a military intelligence agency to be specific, and they are very powerful.
Dear brothers and sisters, your armed forces have never and shall never let you down, inshallah. We shall preserve the integrity and sovereignty of our country to the last drop of our blood. I request you all to remain calm and support your armed forces in the re-establishment of order to pave the way for a prosperous future for Pakistan.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the 1619 Project has a new Hulu docu-series. And it botches the American Revolution just as badly as the print version of the 1619 Project did. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.